listener production.
Just days after US President Joe Biden's disastrous performance in the presidential debate, the Supreme Court today delivered another big win for Donald Trump. The court ruled that Trump and any US president going forward have broad immunity from criminal prosecution for anything they do using the powers of the office. It's a massive blow to the criminal case against Trump in his role in trying to overturn the 2020 election, but it could also have much bigger ramifications for the US going forward. Joining us now is ABC journalist and If You're Listening podcast host Matt Bevan to explain what it all means. G'day, Matt. How big a deal is this?
Well, it seems like a pretty big deal. So obviously the US Supreme Court is split between conservative and liberal justices. The dissenting opinion of Liberal Justice Sonia Sotomayor is sort of talking about this really in very scary terms. She's talking about basically giving the president the powers of a king. And when they talk about the powers of a king, they don't mean the powers of King Charles. They mean the powers of King George 300 years ago, 250 years ago, however long it is the US decided to separate from being part of the British Empire, because the British Empire was at the time ruled by a king that wielded enormous amounts of power. Of course, now we're talking about constitutional monarchies, but they're worried about really all-powerful kings who can do whatever they want without fear of being prosecuted for it. And basically, it comes down to whether what a president does is an official act or a private act, an unofficial act. So you could argue that the president ordering an agency to do something is an official act, but the president maybe, swiping ornaments from the White House and popping them in his pocket and taking them home when he leaves would be a private act that he did while he was the president, but still a private act. And so they haven't thrown out the entire, all of the criminal cases against Donald Trump, but now the prosecutors in those cases are going to have to fight up against this new thing, which basically says if something that Donald Trump did was an official act that he was doing as an act because he was the president and he was enacting the power of the president, then that's fine and he's immune from prosecution for that. But if it was something that he was doing privately, then he can be prosecuted for that. So there is a level of complexity to it, but Sonia Sotomayor is basically arguing that the president can now order the military to enact a coup or, order US Army or Navy commandos to go and assassinate people and that kind of thing without fear of being criminally prosecuted, which is pretty extraordinary.
So obviously the way that this works, we've got a Supreme Court that has 9 justices on it. There's 6 conservatives. They all voted together, so they won, so to speak, the majority vote. That's going to be the law of the land. What were they concerned about as opposed to this concern about potentially assassinating political rivals? What were they trying to do?
So say you're a prosecutor in, some part of the country and you disagree with something that the president does in terms of policy. The conservative justices are concerned that the US president may start to face all sorts of criminal prosecutions from people based on things that they were doing legitimately while they were the president, things that the president does have the right to do. For example, ordering people to conduct military operations overseas, ordering all sorts of things, the assassination of Osama bin Laden, for example. And so they're trying to protect the president from spurious prosecutions by prosecutors around the United States that would potentially stop the president from being able to do what the president needs to be able to do. So that's their argument. The concern is that there is no clear limitation on what those acts could be, and potentially some of the things that Donald Trump did between losing the 2020 presidential election and actually leaving office in order to try and hold on to power could be considered as official acts. And there's a serious concern about what the limitations of what an official act is when it comes to a president misusing that power going forward, which is what the minority justices, the Liberal justices, are really worried about.
And so we're in a situation now where someone like Donald Trump, for example, if he wins, he cannot direct the Justice Department to do spurious criminal investigations into Joe Biden if he loses, for example, but he might be able to assassinate him, maybe?
Maybe. I mean, it's one of those things we won't know until it's tested in the courts. I mean, at the moment, the funny thing about the US presidency is that there has, for a really long time, been all sorts of theories about what the president is immune from. And in many ways, it's kind of a good thing that this is all being tested, because previously, whether or not the president can be prosecuted for what they do in office was totally up in the air. No one really knew because it had never been tested in court. Now it is being tested in court. The results are surprising, but it is at least, making it clear what the Constitution says about what the president can and cannot do. Of course, the current president is Joe Biden, and if Joe Biden decides that he wants to do some of these things, then apparently, he potentially could get away with it, which is extraordinary.
It is extraordinary.
But, obviously, if Donald Trump becomes the president, then he could order the Justice Department to cancel all investigations into him, all prosecutions of him for all the cases that he is being prosecuted for, and potentially that would be considered as an official act and not as, an obstruction of justice or something like that, which is the, potentially what he would have been charged with in the past.
And all of this comes at a very sort of crisis-infused time. Obviously, we've just had the most extraordinary disaster of a debate performance from US President Joe Biden. How has he responded to this?
Well, he's responded basically saying that he agrees with the minority justices, he agrees with Sonia Sotomayor, and that this judgment is a serious threat to American democracy, and that, he's concerned, the final words in Sonia Sotomayor's dissenting document was, "With concern for our democracy, I dissent." And that is basically the message that is coming out of the White House as well. Joe Biden is concerned about what this ruling means for American democracy, even though it doesn't necessarily in the short term prevent the prosecution of Donald Trump, because Donald Trump wasn't acting with these things in mind. Donald Trump, when he, for example, when he paid hush money to Stormy Daniels and then reimbursed his lawyer, Michael Cohen, for those payments, when he attempted to, stay president during the transition period, when he made that speech on the 6th of January that prosecutors allege incited the January 6th riot and the insurrection against the Capitol. When he did those things, he wasn't aware of the guidelines between an official and an unofficial act. So potentially the courts could find still that Donald Trump was committing crimes because he was acting in his personal capacity. But it's more concerning about the future, because now, as long as US presidents feel that they can defend themselves and say that what I'm doing is an official act, then potentially they can get away with a lot of things that they previously wouldn't have thought that they could get away with.
And the state of affairs now is that it's very, very unlikely that any of the other prosecutions against Donald Trump will make it to trial before the election. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, basically because this throws a spanner in the works of all of those prosecutions, whereby they now need to spend potentially months of hearings figuring out what is and isn't permitted in terms of evidence, and what charges that have been made against Donald Trump have to be thrown out before they're even brought into court. So, yes, it doesn't mean that those cases are over, but it means that those cases are likely going to take much longer, and it's only 4 months until the election.
And with that in mind, can Joe Biden do anything now, or if, and I guess it's a big if, Biden wins back the presidency in November, to change this rule?
Well, I mean, he can't just go, okay, now it's not the rules. He can't. It's gone to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court's decided that's the way that it works in America. But the funny thing about it is that, so because of the dysfunction of the American Congress for many, many years now, most US presidents have been making most of their policy changes by executive order. So basically they say, okay, this is the order from the president. But the problem with executive orders is that another president can just undo those. They can just shred those executive orders and go, okay, actually, no, new executive order, that one doesn't apply. So in terms of Joe Biden, Joe Biden could write a whole bunch of executive orders saying, I'm not allowed to do this, I'm not allowed to do that, I'm not allowed to assassinate Donald Trump. But if Donald Trump becomes the president, then he can just go, well, actually, these executive orders don't apply anymore. The only way to do it, like with the only way to overturn most of what the US Supreme Court does, is by passing legislation through the Congress, which is difficult in the current US system. But I think what will be interesting over the next few days is there may be a way that this helps Joe Biden, because Joe Biden can now say to the American public, if Donald Trump is the president, he will be able to do whatever he wants. And that may be a motivating factor for independents and for Democrats to try, that may assist them in getting people out to vote for Joe Biden. Or, we can have a whole other conversation about whether the candidate's going to be Joe Biden or not. I think still the most likely outcome is that Joe Biden is the Democratic candidate. But this may help him, because that is potentially a strong motivating factor for voters to say Donald Trump will be king of this country, able to do whatever he wants without any threat of criminal prosecution. And so you need to vote for me because I'm the only one who can be trusted not to do crazy things with the power of the president that apparently is now far less limited than we thought it was before.
Well, it's a kind of scary scenario on a whole lot of levels watching from here in Australia, but we'll certainly be watching. Thanks so much for your time, Matt Bevan.
Cheers, no worries.
Matt Bevan there. And that's it for this episode of The Briefing. If you enjoyed the app and all the hectic drama that is US politics, please share this app with a friend. And don't forget, you can follow The Briefing podcast on Instagram and find many of our interviews on YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. That's LISTNR Newsroom. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.